Flayed flesh, psychological torment, foreign objects entering the body that you absolutely don't want in there. What is the most painful torture in history? We're going to count down the top 25 historical methods of mutilation to find out. And believe us, the last one is really gonna mess you up. Number 25. Waterboarding. Kicking off the list of most painful tortures is a modern American classic. This monstrous method involves strapping the victim down, placing a wet cloth over their face, and periodically pouring more water over it to keep it soaking wet, a process which simulates the feeling of drowning. The pain caused by waterboarding is mostly psychological, but prolonged sessions can lead to oxygen deprivation, lung damage, and in some cases broken bones as the victim struggles against the restraints. Variations of this torture method go all the way back to the Spanish Inquisition, but its most famous use was definitely as a form of so-called enhanced interrogation by the CIA during the early 2000s. Speaking of enhanced interrogation, number 24. Sleep deprivation. This is another form of torture that was commonly used at Guantanamo Bay and was euphemistically called the frequent flyer program because it involved waking prisoners up multiple times a night and moving them from cell to cell. Other methods of keeping detainees from sleeping involved shackling them in uncomfortable positions, dousing them with cold water, or playing loud music at all hours of the night. Number 23. Bastinado, aka foot whipping. This torture has been recorded everywhere from the Bible to the Soviet Union and was even used in American prisons as recently as 1969. Sometimes the old ones are the best. As its name implies, it involves caning the soles of the feet with a rod or a knotted cord. Unlike regular run-of-the-mill flogging, which we'll get to later, this torture doesn't cause lasting injury, but that doesn't make it any less painful. It was also a favorite punishment of the Nazis. How about some mouth torture? Number 22. The Scold's Bridle. This instrument of torture and humiliation was used in Britain and America in the 16th century. It was pretty much exclusively used on women and was designed as a punishment for gossiping, swearing, or excessive nagging. The Scold's Bridle was a metal mask with a spiked bridle bit that was inserted into the mouth. This would prevent the wearer from being able to speak, since even the slightest movement of the tongue would cause it to get shredded. For added humiliation, the masks would often have animal features, like pig noses or donkey ears, and sometimes it included a bell around the neck. Now, who says torture can't be fashionable? This next one is sure to really make your toes curl. Number 21. Denailing. Unfortunately, it's basically exactly what it sounds like, a form of torture where the nails on your fingers and toes are yanked out. Think of it as an extreme mani-pedi. This torture is still used today in places like Venezuela and Nicaragua, and if you've ever broken a nail or had to rip a broken part off, you can imagine why we put this on the list. During the Armenian genocide in the 1910s, there are records of prisoners not having just their nails ripped off, but also sharp wire and needles being inserted under the nail. Ouch! Now from pulling nails to pulling hair. Number 20. Pitch capping. This form of torture goes back to ancient Greece, but was extremely common during the Irish Rebellion of 1798. Pitch capping was a bit like a body wax on steroids. A conical paper cap full of hot tar called pitch would be forced onto the victim's head, then ripped back off when the pitch had cooled, taking all the person's hair and a lot of their scalp with it. Talk about a bad hair day. But unlike our next example, at least your limbs will still work. Number 19. The rack. To paraphrase Charlie XCX, when you come to the list of torture methods, you want to hear the torture classics, and it doesn't get much more classic than the rack. The rack was a wooden frame designed to stretch via a ratcheting mechanism. The victim's wrists and ankles would be strapped to the corners, which meant that their joints would be dislocated over time as the crank was turned. It's most associated with medieval Britain today, but the rack actually dates back much further, with an early recorded use being in the interrogation of a suspected arsonist called Herostratus in Greece all the way back in 356 BC. Speaking of joint dislocation, number 18. Strappado. This was a popular form of public punishment in the 16th and 17th century Italy, where the victim would be lifted up off the ground by the wrists, which were tied together behind their back. This would lead to the shoulder joints dislocating, as well as long-term nerve and muscle damage. This one was reportedly performed on Niccolo Machiavelli, the human origin of the term Machiavellian, during his prison sentence in 1513, and it was also used by the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. It was extremely painful, but not nearly as humiliating as our next entry. Number 17. Tarring and feathering. This was a common act of vigilante justice in colonial America. where a suspected criminal would be stripped naked, coated in wood tar, and then rolled in feathers. We've ranked it low here since there are no recorded fatalities from this practice, but sometimes the tar was hot enough to burn, and tarring and feathering usually came with the added bonus of being beaten senseless by an angry mob afterwards. If you were really unlucky, they'd also set you on fire. In one case, a man named John Malcolm was not only tarred and feathered, but also beaten, whipped, tied to a tree, and then force-fed hot tea until he threw up. Brutal. But at least it won't drive you utterly insane like our next entry, number 16, white torture. This is a form of sensory deprivation mostly used in Iran, where a prisoner is kept in a soundproof white room, made to wear white clothes, and only allowed to eat white food from white plates. The lighting of the room is even designed to minimize shadows, and the floors are soft, so the prisoner can't even hear their own footsteps. That might not sound especially heinous at first, but it's actually very effective. Going weeks without any new sensory input leads to depersonalization, hallucinations, and full-on psychotic breaks. But enough about psychological pain. Let's get back to some good old-fashioned blood and guts. Number 15. Dismemberment. This is a form of torture and execution that shows up across cultures, but one particularly gruesome dismemberment method was described by 17th century travel writer William Lithgow. According to Lithgow, a punishment for murder in Turkey involved the prisoner being stripped naked, then wrapped around the waist with increasingly tighter and tighter ropes until, well, have you ever seen what happens when you put 100 rubber bands around a watermelon? After one strike with the executioner's blade, that's basically what would happen to the prisoner. But that's not the only nasty thing you can do with rope. Number 14. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. This was the sentence for men convicted of high treason in Britain during the 1300s. This punishment involved being stripped naked, tied to the back of a horse, and dragged through the street, then hanged almost to the point of death. The key word here is almost. Why? Because they wanted him to still be alive for this next part where they emasculated him and disemboweled him, obviously. Then, as the icing on the cake, he was beheaded, and the rest of his torso was cut into quarters. We specifically say he here because the punishment was only ever used on men. Women suspected of treason were burned at the stake. The sight of a naked woman being dragged behind a horse in public would have been far too scandalous. But that's nowhere near the nastiest torture-tastic public execution. Number 13. The Catherine wheel, or breaking wheel. One form of torture that was famously used on women in the Middle Ages was the Catherine wheel, so named for Saint Catherine, who, according to legend, caused one to miraculously break just by touching it before she was set to be tortured. The Catherine wheel was a big, heavy, iron-rimmed wheel that would roll over a person's limbs until their bones broke. A Catherine wheel torture session usually started from the feet up, usually ending when the torturer got to the chest and the victim died from having their heart flattened. But that didn't always happen, and plenty of people survived up to a week after getting their bones pulverized by the wheel. One German murderer in 1581 reportedly survived for 9 days, having been deliberately kept alive by strong drink. We can think of a more painful torture for women, though. Number 12. The breast ripper. Also known as the iron spider, this was an iron clamp that sorta looked like a staple remover, but scarier. It was often heated before use. And as for its use, well, it's pretty much exactly what it says on the label. Like other famous torture devices, such as the Pair of Anguish and the Iron Maiden, there is debate among historians on whether the breast ripper was real or not, or if it was just a piece of Victorian-era clickbait. But we gave it a spot on the list since there seems to be at least some historical precedent for the breast ripper's use. Saint Barbara and Agatha of Sicily were both reportedly tortured with this instrument before being martyred in the 3rd century. So, in the name of equality, let's do another one for the boys. Number 11. Castration. Removal of the testicles has been a form of punishment since the dawn of civilization, with prominent records of it being used to torture prisoners of war during the Italo-Ethiopian War of 1935. More recently, in 2022, video surfaced online of Russian soldiers castrating a Ukrainian prisoner with a box cutter. Castration isn't just for war criminals, though. In the Czech Republic, Pakistani Kashmir, and in the American state of Louisiana, castration is used as a punishment for repeat sex offenders, particularly those who have abused children. In the past, it was also used as a, quote, treatment for homosexuality, which is what happened to English mathematician and cryptographer Alan Turing in 1952. Now back to another classic. Number 10. The Brazen Bull. Also called the Phalaris Bull, after Phalaris of Acragas, the tyrant who commissioned it. This was a hollowed-out bronze statue of a bull with a hatch in the side. The person being tortured would be shoved into the statue, locked in, and then the statue would be heated up until the person inside burned to death. If that's not gruesome enough, the bull was designed in a way that the smoke coming from the sizzling prisoner inside would come out through the bull's nostrils, and the echoes of their screams would sound like a bull's bellows. Ingenious torture method, right? The person who engineered that must have gotten some kind of bonus for his hard work, right? Well, true to form for a guy who would order someone to make this thing, Phalaris decided the first victim to go into the bull was going to be Paralaus, the person who made it. Let's keep the temperature up with this next torture. Number 9. Boiling alive. This is another one that appears across cultures and time periods, because dunking people in hot liquid is apparently a total no-brainer. The Japanese bandit Ishikawa Goemon was boiled alive along with his son in the 1590s. In 1420 in Scotland, the Laird of Glenbervie was boiled alive by rival nobles who allegedly each had a spoonful of their macabre broth afterwards. Torture is hungry work. During Henry VIII's reign in England, boiling was reserved for those convicted of assassination by poisoning. One contemporary source of a public boiling at Smithfield in 1532 said that while some pregnant women threw up and fainted at the sight, most of the village men found it pretty boring, and they would have preferred to watch a decapitation instead. Tough crowd. Even in the modern day, ISIS would sometimes boil their enemies alive in hot engine oil. Speaking of torture in the Middle East, number 8. Crucifixion. This is a method of execution where the victims are nailed to the cross by their hands and feet and left to die out in the elements. While we in the modern day mostly associate this punishment with the Romans, the practice was actually believed to have started in ancient Persia. In ancient Rome, crucifixion was a punishment given to pirates, enemies of the state, and slaves that had killed their owners. Even today, crucifixion is still technically on the books as a rarely used form of punishment in Saudi Arabia and Iran. In both countries, the law states that if you're still alive after 3 days on the cross, you're free to go. Seems pretty reasonable to us. It's still a nicer experience than our next torture. Number 7. The Spanish donkey. This next torture method really gives new meaning to the expression pain in the ass. The Spanish donkey, also called the wooden horse or chevalet, was a triangular bench that pointed upward. A victim would have their hands tied behind their back and would be forced to spread their legs and straddle the pointed edge for an extended period of time. In some cases, their legs would be weighted, both to hold them in place and to increase the strain on their groin. This form of torture wasn't fatal, but it did cause tearing, severe pain, and in many cases affected the victim's ability to walk. This torture was used as a punishment in Europe in the 1600s, but it was also used as a form of extreme discipline by the Union Army during the American Civil War. Now, let's get down and dirty. Number 7. Live burial. This is a truly gruesome way to die. If you don't simply die of fright, you'll eventually succumb to a lack of oxygen. Premature burial was a punishment for a variety of crimes in medieval Europe, most commonly things like adultery and bestiality. In ancient China, the Emperor Qin Shi Huang is said to have buried alive 460 Confucian scholars in 212 BC, and during the Holocaust, some people were thrown into mass graves while still alive, and later had to dig their way out. As recently as the Gulf War, there are some who estimate the American 1st Infantry Division might have buried as many as 250 Iraqi soldiers alive. But at least you get to go to the grave in one piece. Number 5. Sawing in half. There's variation place to place on whether the sawing was done sagittally or transversely. Either way, you're getting cut in half. During the time of Emperor Caligula, they would saw you in half transversely, that is, across the middle. But in the case of Simon the Zealot, one of Jesus' apostles, they opted to go the long way, hanging him upside down and then cutting from the crotch to the head. Sawing in half was also done in Imperial China, where to minimize the body moving around as the halves split further apart, the victim was seated and held in place with 2 big wooden boards. Speaking of China, this next method is one of China's most famous and grisly torture methods. Number 4. Death of 1,000 cuts, or Ling Chi. This involves tying the prisoner to a wooden frame and slowly slicing small pieces from their body over a long period. The torture was reserved for some of the worst crimes: treason, mass murder, and patricide. But sometimes it was used for minor offenses just to make an example of someone. This torture was considered particularly heinous because in Confucian philosophy, removing pieces from a person's body stops them from being able to find peace in the afterlife. But at least it doesn't get animals involved. Number 3. Rat torture. During the 80 Years' War of the 1600s, a Dutch noble named Diederik Sonoy once tortured a prisoner by putting live rats in a bowl, then placing that bowl face down on the prisoner's exposed torso. When Dieterich heated up the bowl with hot coals, the rats became so distressed that they started burrowing through the prisoner's body to try to get out of the heat. Almost makes you want to peel your skin off. Hey, that reminds us. Number 2. Flaying. This is the practice of removing a person's skin while they're still alive. Some of the most detailed accounts of flaying as a form of torture come from the Neo-Assyrians, who lived in the Middle East around the 9th to 7th centuries BC. The Neo-Assyrians seemingly couldn't get enough of flaying, as the act is depicted in detail on multiple stone carvings, kinda like a torture selfie. In one quote, King Ashurnasirpal II once triumphantly proclaimed, "I have flayed all the rebel leaders. I have clad the pillar in their flayed skins." Yikes. But even that is nothing compared to the most painful torture ever. Number 1. Scaphism. This, in our own humble opinion, definitely deserves the top spot. Also known as the boats, this was a method used by the ancient Persians. The victim would be trapped in a boat, force-fed to the point of sickness, then doused in a mixture of milk and honey before the top of the boat is sealed off, leaving only the prisoner's head, hands, and feet visible. The process of force-feeding and covering with milk and honey is repeated every day in order to attract swarms of wasps, flies, worms, and other vermin. By this agonizing process, the prisoner rots in their own vomit and excrement and is eventually devoured alive by insects. Truly a horrific way to go. Now check out most brutal torture methods by Mexican cartels, or watch this instead.